Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we talk about measuring success, we expect absolute precision. Like, we want to look at the dashboard of our career and see a clear speedometer.
Yeah, a nice clean number.
Right. And in the industrial era, this was easy. You made, 50 widgets an hour, you wrote it down, and your value was mathematically proven. But today,
It's completely different.
it is. If you look at the reality of modern professional knowledge work, that dashboard is, well, it's completely dark. We're dealing with invisible cognitive labor. The numbers aren't neatly tracked, and the actual impact of what we do all day is, frankly, pretty murky.
Right, and because it is murky, people panic. They feel this intense pressure to quantify their value, which leads to some incredibly questionable claims on resumes and performance reviews.
Which is exactly why the Living Professional Record, or the LPR methodology, was developed. It gives us a framework to navigate this professional muddy water. So today we are diving deep into the LPR Academy's doctrine of evidence literacy, which operates on a very strict primary rule, right? Evidence comes before wording.
A rule that sounds perfectly simple until you sit down with an actual human being and try to apply it to their messy, undocumented career history.
Precisely. And that tension right there brings us to the core disagreement we are exploring today. So, in the absence of clean, hard metrics, how should an advisor handle what the LPR system calls measure clues?
Right.
For context, for the listeners, a measure clue is an early indicator of scope, scale, frequency, change, or value. Think of things like the size of a team, a before and after condition, or a decrease in repeated questions.
Or like handoff, confusion reducing.
Exactly. So the debate is, are these clues robust enough to ground a professional claim on their own through qualitative description, or are they strictly incomplete leads that demand a verifiable hard metric to be considered true evidence?
It really is the dividing line between a rigorous record and, well, a work of fiction.
Let's lay out where we both stand then. I hold the position that measure clues like reduce handoff confusion or broader team visibility when paired with deep operational context constitute highly valid, sufficient evidence. They allow an advisor to form a grounded professional claim without ever needing a tracked number.
And I take the position that a measure clue is fundamentally just a lead. I mean, it tells you where to look, but without verifying the underlying metric, any resulting claim remains dangerously close to an unsupported assertion. If we rely on clues alone, we fail the strict standard of proof required by the LPR system.
Okay, I want to start by looking at the reality of how work actually happens on the ground. Because let's be real, not all work produces clean metrics.
True.
Let's say a client notes that a new intake process they implemented saved a lot of time. Now, the LPR system strictly forbids the advisor from inventing a metric.
Never.
Right, we can never, ever write reduce time by 40% just because it sounds punchy. We both completely agree on that. We never invent numbers. However, I argue that if we accurately describe the improvement, say by writing improved consistency in the intake process, we don't need a final mathematically tracked number. The clue itself, the before and after condition, is valid evidence.
But a clue is not a final metric. The source material is very, very explicit about this. Measure clues are highly useful, yes, but they are useful for asking better questions.
But
wait, hear me out. When a client says it saved a lot of time, the advisor's job is to ask, was time actually tracked? Did anyone comment on the change? Was there a documented before and after comparison? If the number cannot be supported, the claim remains fundamentally incomplete.
But the curriculum also says that if the number cannot be supported, the advisor can still describe the improvement accurately without inventing a percentage.
Yes, accurately. But how are you ensuring accuracy? Relying merely on a qualitative description of an improvement without verifiable data risks treating an unverified feeling as a fact.
I don't think it's just a feeling, though.
It often is. And if you are listening to this right now and thinking, well, how do I know if my client is just misremembering their impact? That is exactly the danger. A claim is not proof. Substituting a vague description for a missing metric is really just another form of polishing an unsupported claim.
Look, I hear what you're saying, but I think we are looking at the concept of evidence through two very different lenses here. The LPR system defines evidence much more broadly than just official spreadsheets or analytics dashboards. Evidence includes artifacts, context, witness testimony, and feedback.
It does, yeah. But a trace of value is not the same as verified evidence.
Think of it like this. Relying on a measure clue is like finding a footprint of the mud. Even if we didn't photograph the animal passing by, which, would be our hard metric, the footprint is still verifiable evidence that the animal was there. Why should we discount the footprint just because we lack the photograph? The footprint is a physical reality.
I come at it from a different way. I actually love the footprint analogy, but let's follow it all the way through. The footprint only proves that something passed by.
Right.
It does not prove the specific speed, the weight, or the destination of whatever left it. If a client says, it felt like we moved faster and saved a lot of time, but there was no before and after comparison and time was never actually tracked, what we have is a memory. And the curriculum explicitly warns us that a memory is not the same as verified evidence.
It's a starting point.
Exactly. It might help us locate artifacts or witnesses, but memory alone is not proof.
But the footprint proves existence. If the client's claim is simply improved consistency in the handoff process, and the measure clue is that the team stopped asking the same 3 clarifying questions every Friday, that decrease in repeated questions is our footprint. We don't need to know the exact velocity of the animal to know it walked past.
You only know it walked past if you can verify that the questions actually decreased. Too often, the client is operating entirely on a feeling. It felt like we had fewer errors. It felt like meetings were shorter. The advisor's job is not to validate every feeling. The advisor's job is to identify what supports truthful, bounded claims.
Yes, bounded.
Right. And if you cannot support the measure clue with actual data, you are treating an old memory or a prior rendering like a bullet point on a 5-year-old resume as evidence. We know that professional services are not automatically evidence.
Okay, that's a really sharp point. I'll concede that. If we just take their word for it, we are treating feelings as facts. But we don't just take their word for it. This brings us to the actual mechanics of how an advisor works. The LPR tool designed to bridge this exact gap is called operational texture, and I argue that it makes unquantified work entirely believable and evidence-based.
I know you rely heavily on operational texture, but you know my skepticism here. Walk me through how you think it actually replaces a metric.
It doesn't replace the metric. It provides a different, equally valid form of verification by recovering the operating reality around the work. Let's say the generic claim is improved communication. We both agree that is a weak generic claim.
Extremely weak. It's a professional surface.
Right. But we don't stop there. We use the evidence inventory workflow tools 1A, 1B, and 1C.
Right. The mapping tools.
Exactly. We mechanically force the client to map out the reality. We ask, what was the exact constraint? Well, project information was scattered across 20 different emails. What was the action? The client created a unified weekly update format. What was the consequence? Supervisors could see open issues and owners in one place.
Okay.
So our final wording becomes, created a weekly update format after project information was scattered across emails, helping supervisors see open issues and next steps more clearly. By mechanically mapping that operational texture, the condition, the constraint, the action, the consequence, we make the claim entirely believable. The context itself bounds and proves the work.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Operational texture is brilliant for answering the who, the what, and the why. It makes truthful work readable.
And believable.
It creates a narrative that makes sense to the human brain, which is why clients love it. But readability is not proof of value.
How is it not? It details the exact, verifiable sequence of events. The artifact exists.
Because the texture merely explains the process. Look closely at your own example. Helping supervisors see open issues more clearly. That is a claim of value. How do you know the supervisor saw the issues more clearly? Did they provide written feedback?
Well,
Did the volume of confused emails actually drop? Was there a reduction in missed deadlines? Without verifying the measure clue with some sort of metric, the result is still just a highly detailed, beautifully textured claim. You have moved from a generic claim to a highly specific claim, but you haven't crossed the threshold into proof.
Wait, but think about what happens if we actually enforce that standard. You are demanding a level of proof that simply does not exist for 90% of professional knowledge workers. If we demand a tracked metric for every improvement, we are going to discard massive swaths of legitimate professional value.
We're filtering out the unproven value.
The system explicitly states that evidence includes artifacts and work samples. The weekly update format itself is an artifact. Its literal existence, combined with the context of why it was created, proves the client recognized a problem and implemented a solution.
Yes, the artifact proves the client created a weekly update document, just as, say, a project management certificate proves a client sat through a course. But the curriculum is very clear on this. Credentials prove facts, not meaning. In the exact same way, the existence of a document proves a fact a document was typed. It does not prove the meaning or the value of the document.
So it's useless without a number?
If we don't have the metric, we don't know the value. It might have been a weekly update that literally nobody read.
Okay, but look at the practical consequences of what you're suggesting. Let's talk about the danger for the actual person we are trying to help. Your strict demand for verified metrics leads directly to what the LPR system calls underclaiming.
I would argue it leads to accuracy.
It leads to ignoring evidence the client simply hasn't learned to recognize yet. The material explicitly warns us against the tragedy of underclaiming. If we throw out valid measure clues like broader team visibility or fewer handoff errors, just because they weren't numerically tracked in a spreadsheet, we completely fail to capture the client's true professional value. We leave them stranded in generic professionalism simply because their employer didn't happen to have a robust data analytics department tracking every single email they send.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the alternative? Your leniency risks overclaiming, making language stronger than the evidence supports.
I don't think it's lenient, it's contextual.
But the central doctrine of the entire academy is evidence before wording. If you merely accept a client's belief that they improved consistency based on a nicely textured story without hard confirmation, you are violating the core rule. The advisor does not polish unsupported claims.
But using operational texture and measure clues to arrive at accurate qualitative language is the discipline of evidence before wording. If the client says, "I saved a lot of time," and we discover time wasn't tracked, we follow the rule. We don't write, "reduce time by 40%. We ask the measure clue questions from clip 4.
Right.
We ask, did repeated questions decrease? We find out that yes, the team stopped asking the same 3 questions every Friday. So we write, reduced repeated follow-up. That is not overclaiming. That is precisely bounding the claim to what the evidence supports. It is the truest supportable claim.
Except reduced repeated follow-up is still a claim of frequency, and frequency is a measure clue. You are using the measure clue as the final output rather than treating it as the early indicator it was meant to be. The material states, measure clues are evidence leads. They are not final metrics unless verified.
Unless verified, exactly. But verification in the LPR system isn't just numbers. Let's, demystify what verification can look like. Verification can be witness testimony. Verification can be feedback. Verification can be the logical reality of a before and after condition. If information was scattered across 20 emails and now it is in one unified document, the before and after condition is the verification of improved consistency.
Only if you actually recover the 20 emails and the new document and confirm the condition. The danger here is that clients frequently misremember the past. They remember their intentions rather than their actual impact. They build professional surfaces, like a highly polished LinkedIn profile or an AI-generated summary, that make them sound like strategic visionaries who solved every problem.
Sure, people embellish.
Exactly. But AI output is a prior rendering, not evidence. A job posting is market context, not evidence of the client's actual work. We are trained to look beneath that language. If an advisor settles for operational texture without pushing for the hard verification of the measure clue, they are just replacing an AI-generated professional surface with a human-generated professional surface.
You're assuming the advisor is just taking dictation. But the operational texture process is rigorous. The advisor is actively mapping the experience to the evidence, finding the measure clues, identifying the constraints, and looking for witness feedback. By the time we arrive at the wording, we have triangulated the truth through multiple qualitative data points.
Triangulation is excellent, provided the source strength is actually sufficient for the claim being made. The material tells us that source strength is always claim-specific. If the claim is, I manage logistics, an old resume bullet is incredibly weak evidence. If the claim is, I created a new intake form, the physical artifact of the form is strong evidence. But if the claim is, I improved the intake process, the form alone is weak evidence without a measure clue being verified by a metric.
Okay, let's step back and look at an edge case that I think proves why qualitative description is so vital. What happens when a client does have the hard metrics, but they can't show them to anyone?
Oh, you're talking about privacy constraints?
Exactly. This is something every listener dealing with proprietary work faces. Let's say the client has an internal spreadsheet that mathematically proves they reduced handoff errors by precisely 32%. That is confidential, employer-owned data. The advisor cannot use that spreadsheet publicly. It might have to be excluded entirely or at best transformed into a metadata-only entry.
For those unfamiliar, a metadata-only entry means we record the existence of the evidence like internal Q3 analytics report without exposing the confidential data inside it. We use safe summaries to protect the worker and the employer.
Right, we keep the private data private, but we extract the public value. So in that scenario, the advisory is forced back into relying on a qualitative description anyway. We can't publish the 32%. We have to write something like, overhauled intake process, reducing follow-up inquiries. If we have to use qualitative descriptions to protect privacy, why can't we use them when the metric is simply a measure clue grounded in strong operational texture?
That is a fascinating point, actually. But I think it proves my side of the debate.
Oh, really?
Yes, the system requires us to protect the worker using safe summaries and redactions. But the fact that we can't publish the metric doesn't mean the advisor shouldn't require the metric to verify the claim internally before drafting the summary. Evidence-rich does not mean evidence exposed. Proof is not permission. The advisor must see the proof, the actual spreadsheet, even if the public only sees the bounded qualitative claim. If the metric never existed in the first place, the advisor is flying blind, relying purely on the client's memory.
I don't believe we are flying blind. If we have operational texture, we know the exact condition, the constraint, the action, and the consequence. We are flying visually instead of by instruments. We are using the context to validate the claim.
Flying visually in a fog of memory is how clients end up overclaiming. The system explicitly warns us against this. A skill is a claim until evidence supports it. You can say, I solve problems, or I manage projects, but until we locate where that skill was used, under what conditions, and with what outcome, it's just generic professionalism. My fear is that treating unverified measure clues as sufficient evidence allows clients to claim skills they haven't truly mastered, just because they can describe a time they casually participated in a process.
But that is exactly why the advisor asks, did the client lead, coordinate, support, or observe? We bound the claim to the exact nature of their participation.
But without a metric, how do you measure the outcome of that participation?
By the observable changes in the operating reality. If a team was chronically missing deadlines, and the client introduced a risk tracking matrix, and the team stopped missing deadlines, that is the measure clue. Before and after condition, it is listed verbatim in the curriculum as a valid measure clue.
Yes, a clue, which prompts the advisor to ask, were the deadlines actually met, or were they just adjusted in the system? Was the matrix the causal factor, or did the overall workload just decrease that month? The metric, the actual tracking of the timeline data, answers those questions. The clue just tells you what questions to ask.
I think we have reached the fundamental core of our disagreement here. You view the measure clue at the starting line of an investigation that must inevitably end in a number. I view the measure clue, when deeply contextualized by operational texture, as a complete, verifiable, qualitative state that allows the advisor to render a truthful claim.
I think that is a very fair summary of our divide. I believe your approach, while well-intentioned, risks mistaking a highly textured professional surface for true evidence.
And I believe your approach demands a level of quantitative tracking that simply doesn't exist for most modern cognitive workers, risking the tragedy of underclaiming,
where we leave incredible professional value completely unrecorded.
Well, despite that divide, we do have a massive point of convergence here. We both vehemently agree on the core doctrine: an advisor must never ever invent metrics.
Absolutely. Turning saved a lot of time into reduced time by 40% just because it sounds punchier on a resume is a catastrophic failure of evidence literacy. Numbers are only useful when they are real.
Exactly. And we both agree that our goal is not just to make the client sound better. We are not language polishers. We are source governance professionals. The fundamental question we must always ask is, what does the evidence actually support?
Precisely. And answering that requires incredible judgment, evaluating source strength, navigating privacy limits with safe summaries, distinguishing a prior rendering, like an old AI-generated bio, from actual source truth. It is a complex ecosystem.
It is. And the material offers so much more depth on how to handle those constraints, and how to rank source strength depending on the specific claim being made. The methodology goes far beyond just measure clues.
It really does. Balancing these two perspectives, the strict demand for hard verification and the practical necessity of qualitative contextualization, is essential for discovering what the LPR system calls the truest supportable claim. We will leave it to our listeners to decide just how strict that standard of evidence must be in their own practice.
Because at the end of the day, you have to be able to stand behind the record you help build.
You do. Which brings us right back to that dark dashboard we started with. Professional life in the knowledge economy doesn't give us a perfectly calibrated speedometer. Most of the time, we are out in the woods looking down at the mud. We have to decide if that qualitative footprint is enough to prove the value is there, or if we're going to sit in the dark and wait for a mathematical photograph that might never come. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.